Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the AT&T Domestic Violence Digital Safety Initiative webinar. My name is Stephanie Nunley. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Training and Event Coordinator here at MOVA. I'll quickly review some logistics before passing it over to our wonderful presenter. This is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you can see the presenter, ASL interpreters, and the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask them. We will pause throughout the presentation to answer any of your questions. Again, today we do have ASL interpretation and CART captioning available today. To see the closed captions, please go to the bottom of the screen, click the arrow next to closed captions, and choose Show Subtitles. You can also view the CART interpretation on a separate screen if you'd like. I will drop that in the chat. Again, and if you need help during the session, please feel free to message me directly in the chat and I'll be happy to assist you. Now, I will take, it's an honor to go ahead and welcome our presenter today, Ed Donnelly. Hi, Ed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to get to make this presentation as part of the activities that MOVA is putting on for April. Really happy to do it, and it's a new program that we've been kicking off and here in Massachusetts, and so it's really exciting to get to, this is probably one of the biggest groups we've ever presented to, so it's going to be really exciting. Just by way of quick background too, I also want to thank the folks at MOVA. In particular, I used to work with Liam Lowney back in the day, and I think he was really a huge influence on me, and really it's part of the reason I kind of helped grow professionally when I worked with him, and kind of led to, I think, some of this awareness that led to this ultimate program. So, huge thanks to Liam and Lisa there, and obviously Jesse from MOVA as well, who I was looking at our notes, and I touched base with Lisa and Jesse almost a year ago as we were putting this together. So that's been, kind of a nice full circle moment to come back to this point today. And then lastly, another person I think is on the call is Erica Olson from the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and a huge shout out to her as well. She was one of the first people I kind of was talking to about this idea, and has been a huge supporter and just incredibly helpful resources when we put this together. So, like I said, just by way of background, I'm the Director of External Affairs for AT&T. I cover Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Possibly more for the relevant purposes of this presentation. Prior to AT&T, I worked as an Assistant Attorney General in Massachusetts. And when I worked in that office, I also had the opportunity to work on a rotation in the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in the Roxbury Division of the Boston Municipal Court. And those two places were kind of where I first got exposed to, sort of the issues that the domestic violence community is facing and what survivors are facing, and kind of what that whole process is like. And, and then the other part of it that I like to talk about when we talk about this is kind of where this came from. And I think the kind of hopeful note in all of this is this whole idea really started with a survivor. I was on the phone talking to a customer. She was from a tiny little town in Western Massachusetts, and we were talking about issues entirely unrelated to domestic violence. And at the end of the call, she kind of stopped me and said, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about what I went through and the role that wireless technology played in sort of exacerbating a situation as I was trying to leave an abusive relationship. And almost immediately that kind of sparked, it was kind of this weird, or this not weird, but it was a really interesting trigger that brought together kind of my experiences professionally, having worked in the Attorney General's office and now working in AT&T. And it just sort of clicked and it made sense. And I was like, oh, this is something that our company should be looking to work on and try to support survivors. And so, I joke around that we were off and running at that point, and that was 4 years ago. So clearly I'm not the fastest runner you'll ever encounter. But we eventually got to the finish line, and that's really the important thing. So we launched this program in February here in Massachusetts, at the end of February, with a really nice event at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And so now we're taking this program around the state. It's a pilot in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which are the two states I cover. And we're just getting the word out. the audience, or it's really two audiences that we're really speaking to, or we're trying to speak to with this initiative. Both survivors of domestic violence directly, but then, just as importantly, those that serve them, right? Those that are helping them, whether it's law enforcement, government officials, healthcare providers. Unfortunately, it runs the gamut of folks that could be serving a survivor in one way, shape, or form. And so we're really trying to equip them with information through this program. We do want to start with a bit of a disclaimer. So as you'll see, this presentation is for informational purposes and does not constitute legal advice or safety planning. We're encouraging people to consult domestic violence support group or domestic violence support agency or local law enforcement if they're experiencing domestic violence. Now, we've built this program to try to be as general as possible. AT&T takes its role in the community very seriously, and whether you're a customer or not, we see a role for us to try to help in the communities where we do business. And so most of the information is generally applicable. However, there are some nuances and variations that may exist. So we encourage survivors and advocates to confirm different information with the providers that a survivor might be utilizing. So this is a kind of a quick roadmap and an agenda of what we're going to cover. We're really trying to build this program sort of as a tool for safety planning in the wireless context and in that wireless technology context. So we're going to kind of map that out a little bit here. And so the other thing that I think is really crucial, and one of the things that I'm really proud of, is that we really built this program with the survivor and really with the advocacy, the domestic violence advocacy community. I met with a whole host of folks as we were developing the content for this presentation across various industries in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And what was really helpful was actually this quote that I think is really what orients the whole presentation, which is that survivors will know what is best for them. It was actually provided to me by an advocate after we did the presentation, when that advocate was speaking about the benefit of the program. We're trying to equip survivors and those that serve them with the information that they need to really promote safety planning. And the other thing that's important in this regard, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here given the likely audience, but every situation is different. And so we really can't provide concrete advice or guidance because telling one survivor to change a password might be a great solution for one survivor, but it might not be a good solution at all for another survivor. So we want folks to really know and understand this kind of action and reaction that occurs in the technology space and some of these issues related to wireless service, so that they can take that information and apply it. And there are really no trade secrets here. This is all public information and accessible information that we are trying to effectively repackage and tailor to safety planning and what we worked with as far as sort of the needs that advocates and survivors might need. So that's kind of a little bit of an orientation on the program, a little bit of a background around myself and kind of what kind of got us to this point. So defining the issue here is sort of what's become known as technology-enabled coercive control. And that's a form of domestic violence that relies on technology to control, harass, or intimidate a current or ex-partner. And it includes a whole variety of different types of behaviors: monitoring, impersonating, stalking, really behaviors that allow technology, that allow an abuser to stalk or harass through technology. It's actually a really exciting time in some ways in this regard in Massachusetts. Just last year, the legislature passed and the governor signed an act to prevent abuse and exploitation, which effectively created a new grounds of relief that survivors of domestic violence can apply for through the 209A process, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And that's, I think, a really important additional tool that's been laid out to support survivors in the advocacy community in this space. And the way I kind of like to think about this a little bit is that what our presentation is it's kind of preventative medicine, right? So it's trying to equip folks with ways to either deal with or avoid some of the challenges that technology might pose for survivors in these situations. So um, that's kind of what we're leading into. And the other thing I do want to flag, just as a housekeeping matter as well, we have at the end of the presentation some QR codes that will take you to the landing page that our company developed for our website. And there's information there on a lot of the things we're going to talk about. So I don't want folks to feel obligated to sit there and have to take a million notes for things like we're going to get into the Safe Connections Act and some of the logistics there. So that stuff is all included on the website that we built with some handouts for folks to utilize. So the way we're going to orient this presentation is sort of it's in three parts. So the first part really relates to wireless accounts, um, family and shared plans, and then, how to navigate those in domestic violence situations in the sense of what information is available, what information is not available, and how can that be a challenge or a way that the survivor can take some control back. The second part of the presentation, we're going to cover hardware. So some of the vulnerabilities that the actual device itself can create through its settings and through things like Bluetooth headphones and Bluetooth location devices. And then the last part of the presentation, we're going to cover software and wireless software. And that is going to be in two parts. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about spyware and stalkerware. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how everyday applications can pose or can create vulnerabilities for survivors of domestic abuse, just so that they can understand, again, how these things work and apply that knowledge to their own situation. But this is, I got a little bit ahead of myself, but this was the slide kind of laying that out there so you can kind of see what the roadmap is going to be here. So this actually all started when I kind of had this idea. I was talking to an advocate that we worked with, and I was kind of saying, like, how do we deal with this? What do we want to talk about? How do we want to kind of ground this presentation? And what they said was really interesting. They said, when a survivor comes to them and it is in that like initial crisis mode, they feel kind of surrounded and trapped and overwhelmed, and they feel like, oh, the abusive partner's listening to my calls and knows what I'm doing and knows so much about what's going on. Like, are they spying on my phone? Like, what? So with that kind of framework in mind, we wanted to sort of start at the beginning and kind of slowly kind of deal with all those issues that are involved to try to create some safe harbors and some understandings. And the first thing that jumped out at us as the kind of obvious starting place was this idea of family and shared plans and like what's going on, what can be seen, what information is out there, and how can that potentially be a vulnerability, or how can that be something we educate around. And so in that regard, especially given the nature of these relationships, it's so common that the abusive partner has a family or shared plan with the survivor. The abusive partner is the account holder and the survivor is um, a, a, an affiliated line with that account. And so that was kind of the touch tone. So what we wanted to start with was like, okay, what can the abusive partner see, right? What, just through the account portal. Now there's some other things we're going to talk about that, but what can they see and why is it important for survivors to be aware of that? So just through the account portal, it's important to know that the account controller, the account holder, the abusive partner in this case, has basically real-time access to the phone call log. And so this is really just the straight up listing of numbers that the associated lines on the account have made. So for example, if the survivor is making phone calls, to prepare to leave or for safety planning or right after they've departed, the abusive partner may have access to or will have access to those numbers that the survivor has called. Now, why is that relevant? When we were talking to the advocates about, okay, well, for better or for worse, those phone calls might be kind of leaving a breadcrumb trail or something along those lines of signs of what's going on. Okay, maybe the abusive partner is able to piece together that calls have been made to certain family members at certain points of time, or alternatively, maybe calls have been made to certain locations or even like restaurants, or, like, for example, they call a pizza store, and that lets them know that they're in the town where the survivor's, sister or brother or mother or aunt live, whatever the case may be. So the call history in and of itself is accessible in real time, and we want folks to be aware of that. Now, the content of those phone calls, what has been said on those calls, is not accessible through the account portal. However, we're going to talk about later in the presentation some ways that that could be the case, where the actual content of the phone calls could be accessible or could be listened in on through Spyware and stalkerware. Now, related to the call history is sort of the text message log history, and that's sort of the same idea, that just through the account portal, the text messages that a survivor might be making in this situation will be visible. Only the numbers that have been texted to, or have been outgoing, if it's being sent through the account portal or through the account itself, and not through something like iMessage or whatever. That doesn't go through the account portal. But it's important to understand that as well, for sort of the same reason. This is a little bit maybe less helpful because the text could be going anywhere, but it's still important to understand what the dynamics are in the account portal, as far as what can be seen and not. Now, again, the content of the text messages cannot be seen through the account portal unless some other things have been occurring. So it is possible, for example, on certain devices, to sync text messages to like a laptop or iPad or a tablet or something along those lines. And that can unfortunately reveal the content of text messages. So it is important for the survivor to be aware, if they can be aware, whether that kind of linkage between the phone text messages and another device has occurred. And then the last thing we wanted to talk about around account control relates to service suspension and cancellation. And this was something that was also raised by a survivor, as far as like, what other steps could an abusive partner try to take through the account to control or cause problems for the survivor. So the first thing we want to get into is service suspension. So an abusive partner that's holding the account could suspend the survivor's service. And what we wanted to think about here were sort of the two scenarios. One where the service is suspended, but the partner has possession of the device. And another scenario where the abusive partner suspends service and the survivor does not have the device, because the circumstances are, as you can imagine, quite different. So when the service is suspended, that means that the survivor can no longer make calls, send texts, or otherwise access any type of data connection through the wireless network. Now, that's the equipment that the cell phone provider has set up. So, towers, radios, all those things. However, if the device is still in the survivor's possession, that survivor can still rely on Wi-Fi network, on a Wi-Fi network, to ensure some connectivity for the device. Now, that being said, even under service suspension scenarios, calls to 911 can go through, so that will still be in play. But effectively, if the survivor is out in public, not near a Wi-Fi connection, that device is largely not going to be useful. Now, the second scenario, obviously much worse. The service has been suspended and the survivor does not have the device. Now, obviously here, they're completely out of luck and there's no way to utilize a Wi-Fi network. And we're going to talk a little bit about options about setting up new accounts and how that works momentarily, but this is sort of the other scenario, which is obviously a bit different. Now, the other scenario is service cancellation. So we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the three scenarios. One, there's no cancellation, service proceeds as usual. The second, similar to what we just talked about, the abusive partner cancels the service, but the survivor still has the device. Third scenario, abusive partner cancels the service and takes the device. So obviously, first situation is business as usual. We would, we want the survivor to basically to think about applying other parts of this presentation to promote their safety or other safety planning purposes. Being aware, for example, what the account portal could reveal to the abusive partner. Being aware of, if text messages are linked up with another device, things like that. The second scenario is when the service is canceled, but the survivor still has possession of the device. Again, it's in this situation, what we want to talk about is creating a new account, right? Trying to get out of this account with no service and setting something new up. And we're going to get into that in a moment. And so the one benefit here is that the abusive partner will no longer have access to the device usage. So that control is sort of terminated once that, at least in real time, once the service has been terminated. And then the other situation here is the abusive partner cancels the service and takes the device, or otherwise that the survivor doesn't have access to the device. And this is where we want to spend a little bit of time talking about the cloud. And we're going to get into some of the logistics in a moment, but before we get into the logistics, the one thing you'll notice about this presentation is that we really don't make a judgment really positively or negatively about technology. Technology just sort of is what it is, right? And it has benefits, it has drawbacks, depending on how it's being utilized and what kind of awareness it's being utilized with. And the cloud is a clear example of something like that, right? So in those scenarios where a device has been taken from a survivor, either with service suspension or service cancellation, there is a benefit in those cases where if certain information has been backed up to the cloud, the survivor will be able to access that information once the survivor has set up a new account, secured a new device, gone through those protocols. However, we also want folks to be aware of kind of how the cloud works as a potential vulnerability for survivors. So if certain applications are being used on a device and those applications are being backed up to the cloud, there's a chance that that information could be accessible to an abusive partner that has access to those cloud accounts. So for example, if a survivor is doing safety planning in the Notes app, but that's backed up to the cloud, or if the survivor is documenting violations of a no contact order, or documenting photos of injuries or things like that, and that's being backed up to the cloud, that could be problematic because those could be sort of triggering information if an abusive partner sees it. So that's something that we really want to emphasize, is that really trying to understand how these types of things work and both the benefit and the drawback. Obviously, the benefit is clear here. If, for example, contacts are backed up to the cloud, the survivor will be able to take that information down off the cloud and really be able to undo some of the damage that had otherwise been occurred. Now, with all this talk about service suspension, service cancellation, and the cloud, the other big part of our presentation is getting the word out about a federal law that was passed called the Safe Connections Act. And the reason we want to talk about that is because it's a really important tool for survivors. And it was passed in 2022, and it was effectively implemented in November of 23. And it's a federal law that is making it easier for survivors on a family or shared plan to remove themselves or an alleged abuser from the account. And the benefit here is that prior to this law being passed, survivors would either need a court order to separate from a family or shared plan, or they would need to rely on a state law that changed the threshold for separation from a family or shared plan, which did not exist in Massachusetts. So this is an incredibly important tool for survivors, and it's going to help address those scenarios where service has been suspended or canceled, or even if neither of those situations have occurred, but a survivor needs to separate from a family or shared plan. So how does it work? It is an effort to lower the evidentiary threshold that a survivor might need to kind of overcome to get separated from a family or shared plan. So you can see this is a direct copy and paste from the statute. So affidavits, police reports, and this is included in our handouts, so you can rely on that as well. So they've tried to significantly lower the threshold to ensure that it's easier for folks to separate from these family or shared plans, just because, as we've seen, the amount of control that can exist through these accounts is really tremendous. So the way it works is that survivors that are trying to separate, they have to submit a line separation request, and then also with that request provide one of those pieces of documentation that we listed. We provide an online portal to do it. I'm not sure if other providers do it. That is is we understand the preferred method to utilize, but we've found folks call our customer service line or they use the website. It really is kind of a personal, I think, choice for folks, whatever they're more comfortable with. Now, the other piece of it, so there's two pieces of this that are good to emphasize. The first is that when we're going back to this idea of service suspension, service cancellation, and the Safe Connections Act, the value proposition here is really for a survivor to keep his or her number, right? In a lot of cases, it becomes like a fingerprint for folks. It's how a survivor's family and friends know how to contact them. It's really kind of something intrinsic that they want to hold on to. If the survivor doesn't want to keep their number, this stuff doesn't really apply. They can just go to a store and set up a new account and start fresh. But that is not always not always viable, not always practical. So this is sort of bridging the gap to try to make it so that folks can keep it. Now, the thing that's important to recognize is just because a number gets canceled right away, that does not mean that it's sort of immediately put back into the pool of numbers that we will then recirculate into kind of our general business practice. That number has to age a certain amount of time. I believe it's 59 days. So there is a pretty good amount of time where a survivor could kind of regroup and get to a wireless provider and set something new up and port over their original phone number, which I think is really important. The other piece of it around this is that the Safe Connections Act does require survivors to assume financial responsibility for the new wireless account, unless there's a court order that requires otherwise. Now, that being said, there is this idea of prepaid and postpaid accounts. So obviously prepaid kind of pay as you go, postpaid, you have that monthly bill every month, usually around the same amount. The benefit here, depending on a survivor's financial situation, because obviously, as we all know, it gets precarious, maybe in those initial stages, a survivor is able to port his or her number across prepaid and postpaid lines. So we can work with folks in that regard, depending on what the situation is, to move things back and forth as needed. The other, so we actually anecdotally, I can't share the numbers because they're proprietary, but we have seen a big uptick in the amount of folks utilizing this process in the last few months, which is, I think, a good sign. I'm not sure it's capturing everyone that could be eligible to do it. Obviously, it's kind of hard to measure that, but the amount of folks actually, just the sheer number of them have gone up significantly, which we think is a good sign and a sign that the law is doing its job. Now, the other thing that we want to talk about here, which is really kind of going to be an undercurrent for the whole presentation, is an expression that I kind of came up with as I was working through this, called the notification vulnerability. And it's this idea that really any action, reaction, using certain technology, stopping using certain technology could be a trigger for the abusive partner, right? So in the context of the Safe Connections Act, we do not share information with the account holder that this has been submitted, right? But that being said, the law requires the separation to go through within 48 hours. So it's 48 hours, so 2 business days. However, what's important to recognize here is that separation from the plan can occur at any point within those 48 hours. It could be 6 hours, it could be 15 hours, it could be 47 hours. So if a abusive partner is paying very close attention around the portal and this type of stuff, that abusive partner might see the line disappear, and that could be a triggering event. And so we want survivors in the advocacy community to be aware of this timetable, and that it's a little bit, it's 48 hours, but there's some moving parts within that 48 hours. So we want folks to be aware of that, just for safety planning purposes, ensuring that survivors and advocates are aware of that timetable when they're trying to implement it. The other thing that frequently comes up is around devices. If the device they have is on an installment plan, we will work with folks on. I can't speak to the other carriers. We will obviously try to work with survivors in those situations to sort of resolve it positively. We also will, under the Safe Connections Act, the other benefit that's not totally related to line separation, but is somewhat tied into it, is we're obligated to mask calls to certain domestic violence agencies to sort of prevent that real-time call log from being a triggering item, or like, again, that notification vulnerability that has been at least removed for certain domestic violence hotlines that are called that we block through the Safe Connections Act.
Ed, I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have one question regarding
Sure.
the previous slide. It says, does the police report require for the Safe Connections Act or require documentations of technology abuse, or does it just have to be a DV related report?
Yep. So that's a great question. And so I believe this is probably the slide. So the way it works is it has to deal with a covered act. So the covered act is described here in the bottom, the slide. I can't really provide legal advice, obviously, on what would or wouldn't be covered. But I think if you kind of read through the statute and read through the slide, and this I believe is included in our handout, that can be sorted out. But if there's still questions that persist after this, I'm going to put my contact info in this, and folks can just follow up with me directly, and I'll track it down. And I would encourage questions, actually. We started doing this in public on February 27th in Massachusetts, and we continue to get great questions. Like some of these things, we've been building this even since February and tweaking this a little bit. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I do apologize if I don't know the answers right away, or if they require sort of this type of like legal opinion. Obviously, I'm precluded from offering that, and some things I just might not know, frankly. And so we're going to go back and try to keep building this as we're doing it. So again, we just want to reemphasize, I didn't skip ahead to this slide before talking about it, but just really understanding that 2 business day notification process is really crucial for the safety planning purpose. And we want folks to be aware of it, because this is such an important tool for survivors. We don't want it to be, something that causes problems when it really should be something that's solving problems. So we're going to transition a little bit now into hardware. If there are any questions, we can certainly stop or go back. There's no problem there. But the hardware piece of this is really important as well. And this is probably a little bit better known than some of the account nuances and details that we went into, but it's important to emphasize this as well, because when we're talking with the advocates, we were also able to layer into some of these conversations a bit more about the safety planning and this notification vulnerability that we mentioned earlier. I think someone has their hand raised. Let me see. Oh boy.
Yes, I'm gonna message them directly
Okay,
to you,
great.
and then I can let you know.
Yeah, because I don't want to touch anything. Unfortunately, I was joking around earlier that I do like to share I do like to watch people try to people watch me try to share my screen doing this, because I think it takes the temperature down, because then they realize I'm not a technology person. So that's going to make this presentation a lot more manageable for the audience. So I'm afraid if I try to go into the chat, I'm going to disconnect myself or do something that would otherwise not be helpful. But getting back to the presentation. So the real key thing here, and I think folks are relatively aware of this, but it's important to emphasize as well, is location services. For better or worse, and again, technology, it's not really good or bad, right? Because some of these applications are going to be crucial for survivors to utilize, and some of these different uses of a device. But we want folks to be aware of like just how embedded in a lot of this usage your location becomes with your phone. So the location services are really what turns your phone into a tracking device that's providing information about the location of where the phone is, and likely where the survivor might be, because it's on their person. So we want folks to be aware of like when and why you're enabling location services. Do you need to do it? Are you doing it for apps that are either shared accounts or the abuser partner has access to? That can be extremely problematic. You need to, the survivor has to do the best that he or she can to understand which accounts are shared, which accounts does the abuse partner have access to, because that is tying back in. And while it's important to, we say always log out of all apps, that's crucial, but it also can be problematic, because if the abusive partner has, the username and password, if you're logging out on the application, that information can still be accessed elsewhere. The other part of this that's
Edmund, can we just have a minute to switch interpreters?
absolutely.
Thank you. I think, or maybe he's frozen here on the line. I
He looks a
apologize.
little frozen. You can wait, there's no rush.
We can continue. I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. So the key thing with around hardware spying is really the role that Bluetooth enabled devices can be, the way they can be utilized to either track pin keys, headphones, wallets. I mean, again, there's a lot of benefits to this if you're someone that loses things frequently. But they also can be, unfortunately, used for tracking, right? Pretty obviously that has an kind of a darker usage than rather just finding your keys or making sure your luggage doesn't get lost. However, the key thing with this is that your phone has settings that will alert if these types of devices are recognized as being near you or near your phone. The other thing we want to flag here is related to some Bluetooth headphones can utilize an option whereby a paired phone with those headphones can be utilized as a listening device. So, going back to that earlier example where we had the survivors who are sort of first speaking with the advocates and saying, I feel like they're listening to my calls, all this stuff. Typically, that's not often the case. However, there is an option. And the way it works is that, and I've tried this myself because I was really kind of amazed by it. If you have the headphones in and live listening is alerted on your device, you can leave your device in a room and walk away and you can hear what's going on in that room. So obviously you can imagine the negative effects that could be for a survivor. Again, there will be alerts on the phone that are popping up saying, headphones are near you, devices are near you. And so that is possible that could be part of what's at play here. I'm just going back to this. And the last thing we want to talk a little bit about here around all the hardware that is being kind of pinged on the device really relates to, again, and I hate to be a broken record, but that idea of the notification vulnerability, which in this case would indicate, because if these things are being shut off, right? Or, if you're disabling the Bluetooth and these, this live listening is no longer occurring, or the tracking is no longer occurring, that could potentially be a triggering event for an abusive partner who sees some type of control being taken away, even if it's momentarily or whatever the case may be in that regard. So we want folks to be aware, really, again, how this dovetails into safety planning and how this can affect that process of safety planning. If folks are turning devices off, or turning the Bluetooth off, there will be notifications sent to the folks on the other end. So the last piece of this is we're going to get into more the application part of it, like we talked about earlier. And we're going to start with spyware and stalkerware. Now, the issue here is, unfortunately, rather than trying to build a program that dealt with every single type of spyware and stalkerware that's out there, we're approaching this somewhat differently, because unfortunately it's a little bit like whack-a-mole, where these apps are constantly popping up. They're not necessarily in the app stores. The app stores are not typically where they're found, but some slip through the cracks. But what we wanted to do with this is, rather than, again, talking about all the different ones that occur, we're going to try to go to some signs that you may have spyware, stalkerware on your device. The first one is if you're seeing a surge in data usage on your device and your plan. These spyware and stalkerware apps are designed to provide a ton of information to the person that loaded it onto the device. So as you can imagine, that requires a lot of transfer of data about what's been happening. So that's one sign. Sometimes there'll be unexplained charges that pop up with like text messages and things like that. If you start seeing things that are out of the ordinary, that could be a sign that something's up. Sudden pop-ups on the device is another indicator that something is a little bit sideways with your phone. And then the last one, it's really probably pretty compelling, is if you're seeing a ton of battery drain and your device is overheating. That again is typically a sign, or not always, but it could be a sign, because as we discussed, the data going back and forth on these devices is really tremendous. And so that is causing the battery to just drain right down. The phone's constantly working and it heats up as well. Now, the other thing we talk about is these are designed to just blend in, right? They're designed to not be noticeable when you're on your phone. I know if you're like me, I have like a million apps on my phone that I don't even use, or I know how they got there. And so I'm constantly checking, but this idea that they're trying to just blend in. So the way they'll try to blend in is the most common uses are these double icons. You may try to look like another app on your phone or a popular app, the fake settings, or just sort of a generic icon that's just kind of plopped in there to just kind of blend and go with it. Now, the one thing we want to underscore here again, and not to be a broken record, but this idea of the notification vulnerability is particularly relevant with spyware and stalkerware. Now, as you can imagine, it's providing, they vary in what they do, but they're designed to provide information about what's going on in the phone or the device to the person that installed the spyware or stalkerware in the first place. Typically, these will provide an alert if they've been deleted. So as you can imagine, a notification that an app has been deleted off of a phone, the spyware app has been deleted off of a phone, could be a significant triggering event for the abusive partner. And so that's the kind of key thing to be thinking about with this, with regards to safety planning, is kind of if someone is suspicious of an app, being mindful of how that's being dealt with from deleting it or otherwise trying to deal with it, because as you might imagine, the thought of losing that much control could be a triggering event for an abusive partner. Now, the last part of it we do want to spend some time talking about kind of the everyday apps and how they function. And I think, obviously, again, like we've talked about, and it's a bit repetitive, but we're not really judging any of these, right? I mean, on the one hand, like a rideshare application could be a crucial and essential tool for a survivor if they are without a car and they need to get to appointments or to work or to deal with children or other family members, crucial. But at the same time, because the way it works with those location services and the things we've talked about, if that application is either shared or the abusive partner has access to it, it's giving away a lot of information. Even something, food delivery apps are the same kind of idea. Even something I was shocked when I read this and when I was doing the research, even like fitness apps, I never would have thought, about fitness apps. But if you think about it, fitness apps are giving away, behavior patterns. Maybe the survivor's running every morning around a lake or taking a walk in a certain place, and which they need, right, for the peace of mind and to clear their mind. But it's giving away behavior patterns. It's giving away location if the abusive partner has access to it, right? So, and unfortunately, a lot of these applications function in that regard. Shopping apps, obviously GPS apps, all of these different applications, just through their normal usage and their normal ways of making our lives more convenient and frankly better in a lot of ways, in the wrong context and with that information in the wrong hands, can be a huge problem. And this is again where understanding it is crucial. So the survivors managing it, understanding it for safety planning purposes. We were lucky enough where the kickoff event we had in Rhode Island, the Providence Journal did a big news article about it, and the reporter, in doing some research, was talking to a survivor who had moved states away and had separated, she thought cleanly, and then she used a rideshare app one time and forgot that the abusive partner had access to it, and now the location was given away. So it's unfortunately that type of dynamic that we were trying to just make people aware of. And what we want to layer into this conversation is an understanding of how they collect your data, but then also from a safety planning standpoint, that idea of the notification vulnerability. For example, stopping behaviors, right? So that could be a sign, not using an app anymore. If you've been on a pattern, that could be a triggering event. Changing a password, like we talked about earlier, for some survivors, that might be crucial, but if it's in the wrong scenario for a different survivor, it could be a terrible outcome, right? So, that type of back and forth around the usage, either stopping the use, changing passwords, all those things unfortunately can be at play here because of the nature of the information that these applications contain. And because of that, frequently the value that abusive partners see within that content around what it gives away.
Ed, we do have one question that
Sure.
follows up with that perfectly. They would like to know if there's some practical steps individuals can take to secure their devices and accounts, such as maybe
Yep.
changing passwords or using two-factor authentication.
Sure. So that it sort of I hate to say this, but it sort of depends, right? So typically, um, again, it's not foolproof, but what we've learned is that, for example, like spyware and stalkerware typically cannot be loaded remotely unless it can be, but it's not the most likely way. That's typically something where someone else has had access to your device. So um, that's if an abuse partner has access to a survivor's device, that may be a sign that um, um, something could be loaded onto it. Again, if it's done in conjunction with safety planning, sometimes a factory reset can help wipe out some of those problematic applications. We have heard kind of different things about how these things get tied to like a phone account. So for example, like an iCloud account, if someone has built or goes and gets a new device, but then logs in through an old um, like Apple account, that can be still compromise the device. So unfortunately, it kind of varies with regards to spyware and stalkerware. What the solutions are. It's sort of a case by case basis. I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's a very complicated topic. With regards to securing a device from the passwords, oh, and the other thing is those spyware and stalkerware apps will wreak havoc on passwords. So changing passwords is, if done in a way that's consistent with the safety planning, is something that needs to be considered. And then the last, with regards to passwords, you want to choose difficult passwords that an abusive partner wouldn't necessarily be able to guess. The multi-factor authentication, that's very helpful as well. For securing certain things, but some of these applications don't necessarily require them, so you kind of have to deal with those on a case by case basis.
Thank you.
So, as we're kind of wrapping up here, and I hate that a lot of this is repetitive, but we really find it crucial to kind of re-emphasize and reinforce these things because they're just so important in these domestic violence situations. And this goes both from the leading applications and then also, as we've talked about, altering them by changing passwords, usernames, or other things like that, changing behavior patterns associated with the application, could indirectly or directly notify an abusive partner of, the survivor's intent or what plans there might be, and allow them to read into certain things that, again, could be problematic for the survivor and dangerous. So the way we were thinking about this too, we're going to go to the key takeaways. And when I was doing this, I was envisioning a survivor getting all this information at once, and I really wanted to underscore that they aren't in this by his or herself, and that they have resources that are available to them. So we do have one of our QR codes as links to all the resources that are out there. But we want to make sure that they know that they can access these resources before making critical decisions, before implementing the safety plan, or as they're implementing the safety plan, so that they can understand the potential implications for an action. This is the type of information we're trying to get out for those that are serving survivors as well, so that they can be aware of all these moving parts and all these vulnerabilities and all of these nuances that occur around technology, that it's not really cut and dried, but that all these things, because there's the give and take, the action reaction that we deal with. So we didn't want survivors to feel overwhelmed. We wanted to provide this information, but then re-emphasize at the end of it that there are agencies and resources and so much available to them, particularly in Massachusetts, where all the people who I think are on this call likely to support them in their efforts to get out safely. So we kind of want to go over a quick highlight. And again, the thought was that this was the presentation we wanted to give to that person that came to the advocates in a bit of a crisis situation. Like if you only have 30 or 45 minutes, what are the key things we can be talking about to keep them safe and to help them with their safety planning, or keep them safer? So we want to know the account holder permissions. We want to know the vulnerabilities that can be created through the users that we've talked about. We want them to understand that every action they take could have a reaction. Each reaction could be different in each scenario, depending on what the survivor situation is. And then we're taking all of this and applying it to that situation. So we're hoping that this information will provide these kind of tools and this ability to engage in this way. And I'll leave these up now. These are the QR codes that we've created for the program. And so I'm actually going to, this could be, now that I've finished this, then I'm going to try to put my, actually, Stephanie, is my email address available?
Yes, I can put it in the chat.
Okay, that would be great. Actually, yeah, it's because, and like I said, we feel very good about this presentation because of the input we've had from the survivor community, but we know it's not perfect, and we wanted to start getting it out there, before we had thought of every single scenario. And as I said, we're going to be changing this as it goes, depending on the questions we get and the issues that we've heard from people. So, please don't hesitate to reach out about this. It's a project our company is very committed to, and we want to make it as helpful and useful for folks as possible. So, that is it. I'll stop and see if there are any questions. I'm happy to stay on for a while and answer any that I can.
Thank you, Ed. We're waiting to see. I think we do have someone who might be typing in a question. They would like to know if they're going to get a copy of the presentation.
So right now we aren't sharing the presentation, but I'm happy to talk to folks afterwards and try to do it. And we can do it either virtually or in person. We're happy to do it either way. I just haven't gone through the process of getting the kind of approvals to get this out and have it being shared publicly.
Thank you. We will share the additional resources that are on the QR code on the screen for everyone, so I can send that out in the email. Let's see, we do have a question of what specific steps does AT&T take to protect survivors?
Well, I think this has come up before, and I think we are obligated to protect certain customer information, right? So that is a crucial thing for us. I think we've set up the online portal to help it make it easier for survivors to submit those line separation requests under the Safe Connections Act. We've committed to doing this presentation as a company to try to get the word out about all the ways that technology can be problematic for survivors.
Thank you. We are getting more questions. The next one is, do you have any advice for survivors who are locked out of accounts because the abuser has utilized two-factor identification against them? For example, they have locked the survivor out of their email and therefore the victim cannot complete the two-factor identification for access to accounts.
So unfortunately, I have to pass on that one. I don't have enough expertise to know, especially because that's related to accounts that aren't like email accounts and things like that. I'm just not familiar with that.
Thank you. The next one is, what are some real life examples of how digital safety measures have helped protect individuals from domestic violence?
I'd have to defer to that one too. We've only been doing this for a couple of months. I have not heard anything anecdotally yet around how this has helped survivors yet. I would maybe defer to some of the advocates that we're hopefully going to be working with to try to learn more about how this is playing out in real time. I mean, we've heard a lot that this is one of the advocates that we worked with on it said that this is, other than like housing, this is the biggest thing they're dealing with is tech abuse. And so I imagine that the issues are pretty pronounced that advocates are dealing with every day. I just am not sure yet how this type of information that we've been putting out there has been helping people, because it's a little bit fresh right now. It's only been a couple of months.
Thank you. And then our next question is, what feedback or suggestions would you provide to AT&T to improve their services?
Services for
I want to say they did not specify, but I would have to say their general services.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure I understand the question.
We can ask it was anonymous, but we'll ask them to clarify.
Yeah.
And we can go to
I
the
mean,
next.
I know, like, for example, the FCC put out pretty robust rules around the implementation of the Safe Connections Act. So we've been implementing those and complying with those, which are pretty robust around training for employees and how we're processing these requests.
Okay. And the next question is, how can individuals best protect themselves if an abusive partner knows their device or account information? What would be the next step?
Well, I hate to say it, but I think that depends. I mean, I think it depends on what that person's situation is. That's really the exact issue that we're trying to address with this presentation, so that I don't think there's one best practice that we can point to. I don't think there's one kind of foolproof solution to these things, unfortunately, because it's so complicated and because it's so nuanced and because it's so specific to the situation. And I would just refer back to the sort of the guidance that we received, that I received as we were building this from the advocates, which is like every situation is different. So there's all of these things that we've talked about are ways that folks could um, um, start to take back some of that control, whether it's through the Safe Connections Act and setting up their own account, understanding how like the cloud works and how this data works and how these accounts work. And so unfortunately, like there isn't like a step-by-step process that I could talk about, because what I've learned, and I'm not an expert in this, like I said, I'm a lawyer, and I'm kind of coming to this through that lens is really it really has to be something that's individualized by taking this information and trying to figure out what the pressure points are, what the vulnerabilities are, and then applying it to that survivor situation.
Mhm. And we do have some thank yous in the chat. That the presentation was great, and we're just giving it more time if anyone has any other questions. And we're just getting more thank yous and great information comments in the chat.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. That's a hopeful sign that we're kind of heading down the right path, and that this is information that people are finding relevant. So
That's great. And again, thank you so much, Ed, for being here today and doing this amazing presentation. We really look forward to having you join us again for another wonderful webinar.
absolutely. Oh, I did see Erica just put in the chat the tech safety resource. That's a wonderful resource,
Oh,
and
perfect.
there's so much more out there. We've just tried to distill it a bit more with our presentation, but they have a tremendous resource there. So thank you to Erica for sharing that.
I just shared it out to everyone. Excellent. More thank yous. And again, we will be sharing out the QR codes for additional resources. If you have any questions, please feel free to either reach out to MOVA or Ed with their email in the chat. That we're happy to answer any questions that we might be able to. And again, thank you, Ed, so much for being here today. We really appreciated your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. All right. Have a great day, everyone.